Hey everybody, how's it going? This is once again Mr. Hart, reading Okay for Now. Some things from our last reading. Big moment from chapter 7 was when Doug stood up to Lucas and pretty much told Lucas, hey bud, you gotta quit feeling sorry for yourself. And that was really helpful. For the first time, Lucas took off his bandages. He was able then to suddenly see some shapes, and now he's getting therapy. And honestly, beyond physically helping him, it really seemed to mentally help Lucas as well, because now Lucas really seems to be active in trying to turn his life around. Doug is still doing well in most of his classes. In general, things are going just very well for Doug right now. But unfortunately for us and for Doug, this book is called Okay for Now. So I don't know about you guys, but I got a bad feeling here as we go into chapter 8. So with that, we're going to begin chapter 8, called The Brown Pelican. That's the picture there. Plate CCL1. You remember how I said that when things start to go pretty good, something usually happens to turn everything bad? I was starting to think maybe I was wrong. Maybe things don't always turn bad. What a chump I am. See, one Saturday in the middle of March, I figured out that my baseball, and you know what baseball I mean, my baseball that I had been keeping in my bottom drawer in the dresser underneath my socks and my sweatshirt since I'd started wearing Joe Pepitone's jacket, my baseball was gone. And then on Monday morning, I found out that Joe Pepitone's jacket, it was gone too. When I asked my mother if she knew where my jacket was, she just put her hands on the back of a kitchen chair and held on hard. "Could you have left it at school?" she asked. "No, I wore it for my Saturday deliveries." "Maybe you left it at the library." I shook my head. "On the stairs?" "No." She held on tighter to that chair. I didn't ask any more questions. You see, remember how I said something usually happens to turn everything bad? Remember how I told you that? This was my jacket from Joe Pepitone. Gone. Then one day in late March, one of those days when the sun is sort of teasing you with the idea that maybe spring isn't so far off, the Tools and More hardware store was robbed. Again. And guess who the police came to question? Again. Lucas and I both said that we hadn't been anywhere near the Tools and More hardware store, and one of the policemen said, "Can we see your bike, son?" "Sure," said Christopher. We all went outside, my mother and me, and Lucas and Christopher and the policeman. Christopher wheeled his Stingray up. "You missing a pedal?" said the policeman. "Yeah, I lost it a few days ago," said Christopher. "Where'd you lose it?" "If I knew where I lost it, then it wouldn't be lost anymore, would it?" "Chris," said Lucas, low and steady, "you wouldn't have lost it anywhere near the hardware store." "No, I wouldn't have lost it anywhere near the hardware store because I haven't been anywhere near the hardware store since, gosh, I don't even know when." The policeman took a bike pedal out of his pocket. He slid it on the rod on Christopher's bike, and it slid on easily. "I found this over at Tools and More," said the policeman, looking up at my mother. "It was around the back. Looks like a perfect match to me." It did, too. We could all see that it was the right pedal. Christopher went with the policeman at that moment, and I went to the Ballard paper mill to find my father. I didn't want to run into Mr. Ballard, not right now. So I went out onto the floor looking for my father, but no one seemed to know where he was. He wasn't at his station where he was supposed to be, and he wasn't packing, and he wasn't loading trucks. So finally, one of the loaders said I should maybe try outside on the loading dock. Maybe he was there. And he was taking a break, I guess, because he was smoking a cigarette with Ernie Echo. I then told him about Christopher. And the funny thing was, my father looked right at Ernie Echo. It was the first thing he did. He looked right at Ernie Echo. And Ernie Echo shrugged. My father threw his cigarette away, and we went to the floor. "Swiatek!" someone called, but my father never even let on that he heard. We went across the floor, out the front door, into the pickup, and into Marysville. It took 2 hours to get Christopher out on bail. And in that time, he was fingerprinted. They took his picture for police records, and a policeman tried to get him to confess. But he kept saying he didn't have anything to confess about. And he didn't know anything about the hardware store. And no, he didn't have any idea who did either. And when he wouldn't confess, they put him in a cell for the rest of the 2 hours. and when he came out, he smelled like throw up. A sergeant said that there would be a hearing, and they'd let us know when. But in the meantime, and he looked hard at Christopher, in the meantime, if Christopher happened to remember what happened that night and where all that stuff was, maybe things would go a whole lot smoother for him. Christopher didn't say anything. We went out into the pickup. My father got in front, and I got in front, and Christopher got in the back. Maybe because he smelled like throw up. And then we drove home slowly. But you know, word gets around Marysville fast. Things at Washington Junior High School did not go well the next day. Every time someone looked at me, they gave me a look that said, I know. In geography, I didn't draw the chapter review map of North Africa because I didn't read the chapter on North Africa. And in world history, I told Mr. McElroy, who really cares about the creation stories in the Aboriginal tribes of Eastern Australia? In English, we were still in the introduction to poetry unit, and I'm not lying, if I ever met Percy B. Shelley walking in the streets of Maryville, I would go right up to him and I would punch him right in the face. I cut algebra. Coach Reed can chart his own presidential physical fitness charts. And in Mr. Ferris's class, I wasn't so all-fired excited about the command ship and the lunar module of Apollo 9 that had separated and flown 100 miles apart and then came back together, just like they would for real on the moonshot, which was really going to happen, Mr. Ferris said. He put his hand on Clarence's head. It was the first time astronauts had transferred from one space vehicle to another while in space, he said. Terrific, like I care. That next morning, Principal Petey was waiting for me as I went to school, and he told me to come by to his office after Mr. Barber's class. Mr. Elroy already knew I'd be late for world history, and I'd better not try to get out of it, he said. Terrific. Do you know what it feels like reviewing North Africa's geography, which you still haven't read about, while waiting for the principal's office, which you'd better not try getting out of? At that moment, you wish there was room on that moonshot for you, too. I was waiting a half hour when I finally got into Principal Petey's office, and he looked like he wished there was room on the moonshot, too. For me. So, you're up to your old tricks again, huh? Lucas, the old Lucas, might have pointed out that cutting Mrs. Vern's class was a new trick, but I still get it. I didn't say anything. First PE, then algebra. Actually, it's advanced algebra, I said. Not anymore. Principal Petey doesn't give a student who lacks the discipline to go to assigned classes the privilege of attending advanced classes. Did you know that brown pelican's beak is about as long as the whole body? It's huge, and it looks like it was open wide and fit in a whole lot, like a principal. Do you understand that all actions have consequences? That's what Principal Petey is trying to teach you here, said Principal Petey. At that moment, the pelican was standing mostly on one leg. The other is lying like it doesn't care on the branch, like the pelican doesn't believe that actions have consequences, like he doesn't. You are assigned 3 days of after-school detention starting this afternoon. Principal Petey will be calling your home to explain why you'll be late. The brown pelican, the way he looks out at you, that eye, he knows he's... Are you listening to Principal Petey? Noble. Principal Petey stood up. Yes, I'm listening. Do you want to explain to Principal Petey why you cut Mrs. Vern's class? But I didn't say anything. Douglas, is it because of your brother? If you want to draw the brown pelican, and I'm not lying, it wouldn't be easy. There's something like 9 or 10 rows of feathers, maybe even 11, maybe even 12. And they're all shaped differently, and they're all layer over layer, and the composition is fabulous. He's standing on the big old branch that's starting to decay, but it's still putting out leaves. That brown pelican is right in the middle of the picture, balancing on his leg, and it doesn't seem like a body with so much beak in front could be balanced, but it is. It looks like it should tip forward. All movement, you might remember, relies on that kind of tension. But he wasn't moving. He was balanced just right. It would take a while to figure out how Audubon did that. Principal Petey sat that down. If you're not even going to look at Principal Petey, he can't help you, he said. I looked at him. My brother didn't do anything, I said. He sighed like it was him that was in some sort of pain. Principal Petey has spoken with the police. Your brother stole merchandise from Tools and More hardware store. He almost certainly was the one who robbed the store last fall as well. He probably is also the one who robbed Spicer's Deli last fall. You don't know anything, I said. The sooner you face the facts, here's a fact. I might have been yelling at this point. I don't know. That bird belongs back in the store which it came from. Sorry, back in the book which it was stolen from. Principal Petey looked at this kind of startled. He turned around to Brown Calican, and then he looked back at me. That plate was a gift from the education committee where Principal Petey assumed the responsibility of being principal at this school. It was not stolen. And Douglas, it has nothing at all to do with the problem you and Miss Principal Petey are talking about. I have an idea, I said. When the police figure out who the thief really is and it isn't my brother, then you have to give me that bird and you got to give it back to the library. Got it? Principal Petey considered this for a long time, and I mean a long time. Then he nodded like he decided something, and he said, all right, Principal Petey will take a chance. He'll do that. But meanwhile, you, Douglas, have to promise to attend all your classes without missing a single one. All right, but I get to stay in advanced algebra. He considered this. Then he nodded again. But you still have 3 days of after-school detention, he said. And I held my hand out. He held his hand out, and we shook. Over us both, the noble brown pelican watched, keeping his balance like it had no trouble at all. So I served my after-school detention with Miss Cowper. She gave me 3 more poems by stupid Percy B. Shelley. And she also was sure that I would enjoy. 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone land in the desert, she said. Near them, on the sand. God, I really wanted to punch Percy Shelley right in the face. Guys, who do you think really stole from the deli and from the hardware store? Who do you guys think did it? Anyone? Anyone know? Let's get back to it. It was late in the afternoon when I finally got out of school on that 3rd day of detention. And even though it was a pretty nice spring day, I was a whole lot colder than I wanted to be because, well, if you remember, I didn't exactly have Joe Pepitone's nice warm jacket anymore. Which is why I think Mr. Ballard stopped when he saw me while driving past. He leaned over to the seat and rolled down the window. Hey, my partner, he called, and I waved. Get in, I'll drive you home, unless you have time for some horseshoes. I got in and I looked out the window, and we drove a few blocks. Horseshoes always helps me think things out, Mr. Ballard said. Another block, the dump came in sight. You know what, I guess I do have time, I said. Then Mr. Ballard turned towards the paper mill. Mr. Ballard was keeping the horseshoes in his office until it got warmer. So we went to get together, and he got them from behind the door. You should have seen the orchids blooming with all the sunlight coming in, and we went down the horseshoe pits. The ground was still getting pretty soggy from the winter, and the sand around the stakes was all wet through. It'll be a practice round, said Mr. Ballard. I threw the first shoe way over. He threw the next one. It clanged the post, and it bounced off. Then I threw the next one, way over. He threw the next one, a leaner. And that's pretty much how it went until it got too cold and we went back into the mill. Here are the stats for our practice round. Shoes way over, 50 for me, 2 for Ballard. Shoes thrown short, 0 for me, 4 for Ballard. 1-pointers, 3 for me, about 50 for Ballard. Leaners, 0 for me, 4 for Ballard, what she said was unusual. Ringers, none for me, which he did say was unusual. 23 for him, which, well, that's not unusual. He's pretty good. Did you have a good game? Said Mrs. Stenson when we brought the horseshoes back up to her. It was just a practice round, Mr. Ballard said. He went into his office and set the horseshoes behind his door, and then he came back. I was standing by the window with all that sunshine. Mr. Ballard stood next to me. He picked up an orchid, put it back, and then chose another one that was fuller bloom. It was all purple and white and yellow, like some artist had designed an impossible bloom without worrying about the composition. Like he went wild and let it go. This one will be for your mother, he said, and he handed it to me. And suddenly I felt like I was going to cry, right then and there in front of the office and president of Ballard Paper Mill. I was just going to start bawling like I was 4 years old or something. And all I was doing was holding an orchid for my mother. It's all right. Things will work out. I looked at him. Things always do. I didn't want to tell him that he was wrong, because I'd seen that blackback gull. I didn't want him to start crying too, though. I'll drive you home. Give me a minute. He went back to his office, and Mrs. Simpson smiled at me, which was probably her trying not to laugh, because I was standing there about to cry while holding a flower, a grown boy like me. Then Mr. Ballard came out of his office and he handed me a jacket. This one doesn't fit me anymore, but I'd be glad to have someone else use it. And I took it. And you won't believe what kind of jacket it was. And no, it wasn't a Yankee jacket, even though a Yankee jacket would have been terrific. It was a flight jacket. I'm not lying. A flight jacket. Dark leather, lined on the inside with a soft flannel stuff. It had deep pockets, turned up collar, a flight jacket like you'd wear if you were an astronaut on vacation walking around Marysville before you got to blast off to the moon. Try it on, he said. And I did. It's a little big, said Mrs. Stinson. Oh, it's perfect, said Mr. Ballard. And he looked at me with eyes like they were the brown pelicans. I drove home with him, wearing that flight jacket, carrying the orchid. I don't think I need to tell you what my mother did when she saw that orchid, but I do need to tell you what Lucas said when I told him that I had a new flight jacket. Would it fit me? Not in a million years, I said. He started to laugh. I guess you're right, he said, and he began to laugh some more. Do you know how good it was to hear Lucas laugh again? It was even better than wearing this flight jacket, which, unless Joe Pepitone's jacket turns up, is the only thing I own that hasn't belonged to someone, another Switek, before me. On Saturday morning, Mrs. Mason said that my flight jacket looked snazzy, and she wondered if someone who wore such a snazzy jacket would like a chocolate donut, or if he was too grown up for something like that. I said I'd love a chocolate donut, and she gave me a glass of cold milk so I could dunk it. Mr. Loeffler said my new jacket reminded him of something, and then he went up to the attic so he could find it while I brought the groceries in. I waited, and when he came back, he was wearing, and I'm not lying, a flight jacket, his own flight jacket. Its brown leather was all creased and soft, and yellow woolly collar, and yellow woolly stuff at the ends of the sleeves. Mr. Loeffler, I said, that's terrific. Lieutenant Loeffler, he said, and he pulled the jacket trim around him. Not bad at all after 35 years. And he was right, because it wasn't bad at all. And so I brought my feet together, and I put my hand up, and I saluted him. Just kidding around, but you know what? He got this serious look on his face, like we weren't just kidding around in his kitchen. And he snapped his legs together. He got straighter than I'd ever seen him before. He whipped his arm up, and he saluted me back. And it all sort of startled me. Not the salute, but what startled me was his eyes. I think you could probably guess what his eyes looked like at that moment. He was crying, everybody. Ben, Paulie, Joel, Davy, Franzi, they all loved my flight jacket. They all wanted to try it on, and I let them, even though Joel almost disappeared in it, and Davy and Franzi could have both worn it together and still had plenty of room. Mrs. Windermere said my flight jacket made me look like Errol Flynn. Who? Errol Flynn, the actor. At least he thinks he's acting. I just shook my head. I had no idea who she was talking about. Never mind. I've been trying to write to Mr. Rochester's dialogue all day, and every time he speaks, he sounds like Errol Flynn. It's driving me crazy. She looked at a pack of groceries I was putting away. What kind of ice cream did I order? Pistachio, I said. Pistachio? I took it out of the grocery bag and I showed her. Oh, I hate pistachio. I would never have ordered pistachio. It's green. Well, that's what Mr. Spicer packed. Mrs. Windermere raised an eyebrow. Skinny delivery boy is not infallible. I shrugged. She looked at the pistachio ice cream. Go get 2 spoons and take that jacket off. I don't want to write with Errol Flynn, and I don't want to eat ice cream with him either, even if it is only pistachio. When I got to the library that afternoon, Mr. Powell and Lil were both already upstairs, and Lil had a stack of books that she said she got out for both of us because we were supposed to be working on a project about New Zealand for Mr. Barber. And also, did I remember that we were partners and the project was due in 2 weeks? I'm not a chump. At that moment, I told her I remembered. And then Mr. Powell said I looked great in my flight jacket. And Lil said I looked great too. Only the way she said it made it sound a whole lot better than the way Mr. Powell said it, if you know what I mean. She smiled and opened up one of those books on New Zealand. Do you know how pretty someone can be when she opens up a book? Especially when that someone has brown hair, you know, that same color of that brown pelican's feathers. Mr. Switek, said Mr. Powell, and we got to work. Balance can be achieved in 2 different kinds of conditions, said Mr. Powell. Stable and unstable. Yeah, stable and unstable, I said. Let's say that you're going to draw Lil sitting there by that table, working on that project that you better get on as soon as we're done here. Let's say that we draw that table with its legs on the floor and Lil has her feet on the floor, and maybe the drawing will be wider than it is so we can show that whole table. The table will be stable. Why? Because nothing would look like it could fall over, I said. Exactly. Nothing would look like it could fall over. So in a stable composition, I could have Lil... So if I was to make an unstable composition, I could have Lil floating all the way off to New Zealand? Lil smirked at me. Yes, what else? Maybe the table could be slanted to the right up, with, the legs in the air a little. In such a painting, do you see how much more tension there would be? You don't know where anything is to be headed. Yeah, but the brown pelican, he was stable, I said. And after a moment, Mr. Powell said, yes, you're right. He is very stable. He is, It might not look like he isn't, standing mostly on his one leg on a curved branch that looks pretty rotten, but he is. He wouldn't move if a hurricane blew in, and that's what makes me so noble. Makes him so noble. So I drew the fork-tailed petrels again from scratch because that's what Mr. Powell said I needed to do. But they weren't smiling this time. The water was going every which way beneath them, and the wind was a storm blowing so bad, and they hardly could control their wings. You sure can't tell where they're headed, said Mr. Powell. And he was right. Afterwards, I got to work on the New Zealand project, alone since Lil left because she had a stomach ache. But she made sure to leave all the books with bookmarks in the right places. She could hardly wait to see what I came up with, she said on the stairs. Terrific. And that 1st of April was a gray and half rainy day that still thought it was early March. After school, Lil and I walked to the Ballard paper mill to bring Mr. Ballard a note from my mother from the Orchid and to maybe throw a few horseshoes. Do you know how good a fighter jacket feels on a cold day like this? Do you know how good it feels walking with Lil to throw horseshoes even though it was still half rainy? Even though everyone in stupid Marysville thought Christopher was still up. I went into Mr. Ballard's office and he was talking with Mrs. Stenson. When he saw us, he called, "My partner!" I introduced him to Lil and they shook hands. And I gave him my mother's note that said thanks for the orchids and he hoped that my mother liked them. I told him that she turned it every morning to the sun so that it would grow evenly. And when she watered it, it was like she was feeding a baby. He laughed and asked if we wanted to throw some horseshoes, and Lil said she did, and I got the shoes from behind the door. By the time I turned around, Lil was picking up an orchid for herself, and the sun had come out suddenly, and I was throwing everything it could through that window, and it was all landing on Lil. And she was smiling and brushing her hair back the way she does and being kind of embarrassed because Mr. Ballard was giving her this orchid and was almost as beautiful, an orchid that was almost as beautiful as Lil was. It was a pale purple one with white just barely on its edges. And she looked at me and she smiled, holding that orchid. "What do you think?" she said. "Beautiful," I said. So we left that orchid and went to the office and across the mill floor. The sun was still shining and we opened the door and some of the people on the floor gasped when they saw the light pouring through. "Leave it open!" someone shouted, and we did. We went outside and there, standing against the wall, I guess he was taking another break, were my father and Ernie Echo. They were smoking and laughing like something was really, really funny. The funniest thing in the whole world. And Ernie Echo was wearing... My father said, "What are you doing here?" But I didn't even look up at him, because Ernie Echo was wearing my Yankee jacket from Joe Pepitone. Lil and I went back inside. We walked across the floor. I left the horseshoes outside Mr. Ballard's office door, and Lil took my hand. "You better go get your orchid," I said. "I don't." "Go ahead. Go grab it," I told her. She waited for a bit, then she bent down to pick up the horseshoes and went inside. I was gone before she even came out, because I didn't want her to see me. I ran hard. Really hard, until I hurt so bad it didn't matter that the world was so unstable. And it didn't matter that maybe I was wrong, because when that hurricane blew in, it would throw that brown pelican as far as it wanted to. Ernie Echo didn't come to supper that night. Big surprise. My mother asked if I'd seen Mr. Ballard and given him the note, and I said yes. The orchid was still in the middle of the table, and every so often she would reach out with her hand so that she could look at it from a different angle, like she was studying its balance. I didn't say anything that whole meal, neither did my father. And at dessert, Lucas said he thought it was about time he should be looking for work. Christopher said he could come help him get around if he was able to cut school. And my mother at that point slapped at him. And Christopher said he could get credit for trying, and Lucas told him he'd get by, and Christopher wasn't allowed to miss a day, not a single day of school for the rest of the year. And Christopher said, "How's it come?" And Lucas got real quiet and said almost in a whisper, "Because you're not going to Vietnam. You're going to go off and you're going to go to college." And my father said that there wasn't any way in the whole world he was going to pay for Christopher to go to college. And Lucas said that was why he was going to get a job, because he was going to send Christopher to college. And then my father said he wasn't going to get a job because what could he do with no legs? My father is a jerk. That pretty much ended dessert. There's kind of an angry quiet that can lie over a house. Maybe there are some houses like the Dohertys that never know of such a quiet. That house probably has never had such a bad, quiet day ever. But in the dump, angry quiet was an old friend, and he moved in. No one talked because all we wanted to do was scream at one another. Lucas started going out every morning to look for work. You know how many people in stupid Marysville want to hire someone who doesn't have legs? Not many. 0. He went out in that stupid wheelchair every day that first week of April. Every day. He wheeled himself up and down the street in Marysville and had some place where he might get work. Do you know how hard it is to go up a stupid curb in a wheelchair? Do you know how hard it is to get back up on the other side before a light turns red again? Do you know how many stores even have doors that Lucas could figure out how to open while sitting in a wheelchair? Here are all the things they told Lucas. "I don't think you could do this job from a wheelchair." "Sorry, but I couldn't put up with a contraption like that rattling around here all day." "It'd be too hard on you, son." "The aisles are too small for your wheelchair. You'd never manage." "Frankly, we don't need our customers feeling sorry about someone they walk in. People who know they're going to feel sorry don't want to come back to a store." And there were a lot more excuses like that. But Lucas went out every day. I guess being in a wheelchair can be pretty unstable. But it wasn't unstable for Lucas. Do you know what it feels like to walk around in a house where everybody is going along just fine, when back at your own house, Lucas is going out every day for nothing, and Ernie Echo is wearing your jacket? Well, that's what it felt like next Wednesday night when I came to the Dohertys on short notice again, and Mrs. Doherty said, "Thanks for coming, Doug," and told me where the marshmallow brownies were after the kids were in bed, but that they had already had theirs and they didn't need any more sugar, which I could tell because Franzi and Davy had me by the legs and Joel was trying to push me over, and Polly and Ben were waiting for me so I could fall over so they could pounce on me. "Don't hurt them too much," Mrs. Doherty said. And Mr. Doherty said I was big enough to take care of it myself, and he laughed, and that was cue, I guess, for Ben and Polly, because I was down on the floor before Mr. and Doherty were even out the door. And they were tickling me until I agreed to play bloody, bloody murderer, and then they all went screaming to hide. When I found Davy, I tagged him, and he became a bloody, bloody murderer too. And then he went to the kitchen and found Polly, and she became a bloody, bloody murderer too. And then we went. Well, I guess you can figure out the rules. And after that, we all had some cold milk, and I let them have a tiny piece of marshmallow brownie. And then we started on our reading, which you might remember takes a while. Franzi had a new book, and I don't care what anyone says, elephants do not need to wear clothes. Davy made me read about this kid who had a name like Tick-Tock, Tiddly, Wink, Timble, or something like that I could never read right. And Joel about died laughing when I tried, and you couldn't do it either, let me tell you that much. Joel had a book about Ben that he thought was great because he had a brother Ben, and this Ben could figure out how to jump on top of a castle, and could I guess how he did it. "You can't jump to the top of a castle," I said. And Joel started laughing and laughing and laughing because you can too, so go ahead and read it. Polly had this book about a house in a forest where Laura lives with Pa and Ma and her sisters. You'd be surprised how good this was, especially considering that nothing actually happens in it. And Ben had this book about a pig that went to Florida and turned out to be funnier than it sounds, which was good because there was a whole lot of books with this pig, could I believe it? And Ben wanted to read every single one of them. Terrific. So by the time the pig got on his way and all the kids got to bed, it was probably later than the Dohertys would have wanted to, but it usually was. And I was sitting on the upstairs hall listening to everything settle into a kind of sweet and beautiful breathing. Mrs. Vern had given us more quadratic equations than she should have for advanced algebra, and then 4 problems about 2 men who were driving in different directions at different speeds for different amounts of times, and who cares how far apart they could get before one of them ran out of gas, and then they were breathing wasn't sweet and beautiful anymore. I was wheezing. Suddenly I heard wheezing, and it was from Joel's room. Breathing, like the breathing couldn't get enough air. So I stood up. I heard that wheezing hard, and it was kind of desperate, like... I went in and I turned on the light, and Joel was looking at me with those eyes. Oh, God. I had seen the blackback gull. I ran to his bed, and he tried to breathe. He could hardly get anything in, though. His eyes got bigger, and he tried drawing in more air, but hardly anything at all. So I ran to the hall, and I called home, and Christopher answered. I told him to get over here, and I hung up. I ran to Joel. Hardly anything. I ran to bedrooms, and I told him to take Joel to Miss Dr. Bottom's house, and he should stay awake with the others until Christopher comes. Is it asthma? He said. I don't know, I say. And I ran to Joel. He is standing by the bed with his back ached, dragging in air, rubbing at his chest, starting to cry. At that moment, Ben ran in. Where's your inhaler, Joel? Where's your inhaler? Joel looks at me like he thinks I can do something. Ben starts down, tearing at the bed apart, and then he runs to the nightstand and pulls out the drawer and empties it on the bed. I can't find it, Joel. Where's your inhaler? Polly comes and stands by the door. She looks at Joel. Is he going to die? She says. I wrap him in a blanket, and I carried him down the stairs and out the door. Joel puts his arm around me, tight like he's fighting a bloody, bloody murderer, and he started to run. Do you know what it feels like running in the night holding a kid who's crying, but he can't cry because he can't breathe? And you're running, and you don't know if it's your sweat or his, and he's staring at you afraid and believing in you, but you're not believing in you. And if the Bottoms aren't home, what are you going to do then? But still, you're running in that night, you're running in the night, you're running in the night, and you're running, and you're running, and you're running. Oh, thank God the Bottoms lights are on. I kicked at the door as hard as I could, and I kicked again. Joel was dragging his breaths, but they were getting weaker now, weaker by the second. So again I kicked, and that door opened. It was Dr. Bottom. Oh, at least I hope it was. One look at us, and he reached out, and he took Joel. Otis, get the shower running. Hard as you can get it, now! At that moment, he carried Joel into the living room, and he looked at me, and he pointed to the other room where he wanted me to get something, and then sees that I probably couldn't figure out what he wants, and he told me to hold Joel, and then he he came back with this thing, and he hollered, here! And he told me to hold it out, and at that moment, Joel grabbed it, and he held it up to his mouth, and he pumped. And he pumped, and pumped, and pumped, and pumped. I can hear the air dragging in, but it's less draggy. And Joel, who was starting to run a color that no human being should ever be, but I didn't want to tell you about that until you knew it was going to be all right. Joel at that moment looked at me, and he started to smile. And he kept pumping. And he was breathing. And he was breathing. Sweet, beautiful breathing. Beautifully. Dr. Bottom carried him to the stairs, then he looked back at me. I'm going to bring him up to the stream for a little bit, he said. He looks down at Joel, breathing, watching me. Do you know what he's telling you? I shook my head. Dr. Bottom smiled. I think you know what he's trying to tell you. And I guess I did. Because it was the same thing that Mr. and Mrs. Doherty told me when I got to Dr. Bottom's house and saw that Joel was asleep on the couch, covered with 2 Afghans and being watched over by Dr. Bottom, Otis, and me. And by the way, Otis made the coffee for us that night, and for the record, it was a whole lot stronger than Mrs. Windermere's. I guess he was used to making coffee that helps people stay awake. Maybe he's a good guy too, I thought. Mrs. Doherty stayed the night at Dr. Bottom's because she would be there when Joel woke up. And Mr. Doherty drove me home, and when he went back for went back for Christopher, and he drove him home too. Because as you might remember, Christopher was currently over the Doherty's house, babysitting. When Christopher came to the bedroom, I was still awake and sitting on his bed. "So how'd it go?" I said. And this is what he told me. "Piece of cake," he said. "Really? Really? You mean they didn't attack you?" "Hey, I'm not some chump babysitter. I told them all to go to bed, and they did, and that's it. Now get out the bed and you go to sleep, brother." I tried to talk, but, "Shut up, or I'm going to come over there, and I'm going to kick you both." Oh, sorry. Lucas yelled, "Shut up, or I'm going to come over there, I'm going to kick you both to death." You could guess who yelled that at us. I went by the Doherty's house the next morning, and at that moment, Joel was great. And here's what Mrs. Doherty told me. Because they said when they got home, Paulie and Ben were holding Christopher down on the floor, and Davy and Phronsie were beating him around the head with one hand and holding marshmallow brownies in the other. And Christopher was begging for mercy. And when he saw the Dohertys, he picked up Davy and Phronsie, who was still beating at him, but letting go of their marshmallow brownies. And he told Mr. and Mrs. Doherty where Jewel was, and that then they got right into the car right away, and they hadn't even thought about telling the children to go back to bed. Piece of cake, Chris tells me. After school, Mr. Doherty was waiting with his patrol car, and when he saw me, he waved, told me to come over. He opened the slide door, and I got in, and he said he was going to drive me home to thank me, and he put the siren on, and he went off. We went. And that's what Mr. Doherty told me. The night before, when he got back to the house to pick up Christopher after he brought me home, my brother was in a heap of little Dohertys, all asleep on top of him, and he was asleep too, and still holding the book about elephants who wear clothes. I'm not lying, that's what Mr. Doherty told me. Don't tell my brother that I know this. Don't tell him that I know he's not a chump babysitter. And don't tell him that I think he may be what the brown pelican is. Stable. Guys, I want you to think about that in this chapter specifically, what the brown pelican represented for Doug throughout this chapter, and how Christopher at the end represented that thing. I think the brown pelican is a thing of stability, and it's something that Doug wants in his life. He wants his life to be stable. He wants things to be consistent for once. And he wants, even when bad things happen, Doug wants to be good. Doug doesn't want to fall over. But he finds more and more that Doug kind of loses it, if you guys have noticed a pattern. When things don't go right, Doug doesn't handle it too well. Guys, we are going to finish this book this week. So we got 2 more chapters. Look for them in the next couple days. I hope everyone has a great day. I don't know. For me today, it's Sunday and it's supposed to be very nice out, so I'm excited. But I hope whatever day it is that you guys read this, that you guys have the best day possible. I miss everybody, and take care.